Less than 10% of infrastructure investment in Africa comes from private sources. Despite the huge gap, African investors are struggling to make their contribution. Obstacles ranging from risk perception, rates of return, regulations, and the capacity to secure long-term loans have held Africa's infrastructure development back. These are some of the key pointers discussed at this year's Africa CEO Forum in Abidjan.
The two key elements that we're trying to put in place for the Africanization of the infrastructure sector in particular is how do we mobilize the massive amounts of investment capital that is already available on the continent, and how do we convince the people that are controlling that money to prioritize the infrastructure sector as a viable asset class to give them a return. The second piece that we are looking at there is how can the African investors in developing these projects find the right partners and find the right capital for themselves to be able to afford to participate in what are generally very, very large transactions. So it is an element of partnership with global parties and trying to find local currency financing to match local currency revenue. That is what the Africanization of infrastructure means.
To encourage local investment on the continent, CEOs at the forum called for governments to pass new investment laws that make the legal environment attractive.
One of the key focuses of the last 5 to 10 years has been getting public-private partnership legislation to enable private sector investment in the first place. The next thing that we need to do is look at it enabling legislation, enabling regulations to allow for investment into this new asset class. So you will find in many countries across the continent, pension funds, for instance, where we have $2 trillion worth of local currency capital for investment. In many countries, those pension funds are not legally allowed to invest in the infrastructure sector. So the first piece is allowing it and then working to encourage that to move forward. So we have the legislation to do the project. We now need the legislative and the regulatory frameworks to encourage locals to participate in the projects in their own countries.
The delegates also raised the importance of increasing domestic capital to give companies the ability to borrow in local currencies and improve services.
One of the most significant and beneficial sources of capital is domestic capital. No nation built its infrastructure on the currency of another nation. You build your infrastructure based on your own savings. And it is really because Africa has been so behind on its development trajectory that we've had to call on basically international development sources to try to rapidly build our infrastructure. But what we realize is that to be able to impact the diverse sectors of infrastructure across energy, transport, waste, water, that domestic capital is going to be very powerful. Africa has about $2 trillion worth of domestic sources of capital, and to the extent that we can tap more of those sources to work alongside international partners, we would have a much more sustainable finance mechanism for the continent.
The Africa CEO Forum demonstrates the existence of financing opportunities for private investors in the African continent. Data shows that investment opportunities in Africa are stronger in sectors such as clothing, communication, energy, financial services, food, health, housing, and transport.